you've got your Bibles with you, or if you want to switch them on, whichever version you've got out there, it's from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 14 to 27.
And so the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now if the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts of the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, these parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty. While our presentable parts need no special treatment, but God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for one another. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is part of it.
Thank you, Shanley. That was great. Fantastic. Right. Okay. I'm going to invite Rachel to come up and join me. And I'll make some space for you actually up here, Rachel. So this is the point when everybody out there is really happy because I switch myself off and switch you on. Okay, so.
Right, can you hear me? Is this okay? Perfect. And hello to everyone on Zoom. I have been one of those people on Zoom at times, so I know how it feels sometimes if you are there and no one says hello to you. Great, so my name's Rachel. I work for BMS World Mission, and Steve actually contacted BMS quite a while ago about someone coming from BMS, and I live in Leeds with my husband Graham, and and because I'm relatively nearby, I said yeah, sure, it'd be great to come, and then various things happened. Christmas happened, New Year happened, COVID happened, lots of things happened, and now we've got this crisis in Ukraine, and actually this is quite nicely timed actually coming here, because last Friday, so not this Friday gone, just the Friday before, I came back from a trip to Poland and also to Ukraine as well. So you are the first group of people I really have spoken to about this trip at all, because I just hid away in my bedroom for a few days. And so it's a real privilege to be able to come and share some of the stories that I heard and some of the kind of reflections from my trip. So the caveat to all of that is because you are the first people to I've properly spoken to, I don't know how these thoughts are going to come out. So they may be a little muddled at times. And I've been told I've got about 15-20 minutes, and then what we'll probably do is there may be some questions that you might want to ask, and also we'll then have a time of prayer. I've been told you are very used to going into groups for prayer, or possibly, there's a few shakes of head, okay, possibly partially used to going into some groups for prayer. We'll see how it goes. Great, okay, the PowerPoint up would be excellent. The other caveat to this is I put some photos up on a PowerPoint. They're from my phone that I took in various places. So again, I'm not sure how they're going to come up on a screen, so we'll see how that goes. So I went the other week to Poland and Ukraine, and I think there are so many things I could say, I think, from the two halves of the trip. And what struck me most whilst I was there was the people, and across both places. both countries. And in the different churches I went to and the different meetings I had with the Baptist unions, there was their strength and their faith in God that was just absolutely rock solid and such a firm foundation. And it was great that we sung that song with the line "And death is beaten," because actually today is Easter in Ukraine. It's Orthodox Easter, which they celebrate in Ukraine. So they will be, or they have been celebrating Easter, I think a few hours ago in one of their churches in Ukraine that I visited. So he is still risen, he is still rising, and it is great that death is beaten. So let's see if this works. Excellent. Yes, that's not too bad in terms of quality. So this is there's only a few slides with a few pictures just to give you some illustrations. This is in Lviv Central Baptist Church, up many flights of stairs. It's an incredible old building that was a Lutheran church previously as well. And it is the current home of the Ukraine Baptist Union. So they were in just outside Kiev, actually in Irpin, which you may have seen on the news a little bit. And when war broke out and when the fighting was getting closer to Bucha and Irpin and Kiev, they decided to evacuate across the country to Lviv, where they knew it would be slightly safer. And they set up their office in Lviv Central Baptist Church. And this is just some of the team and one of my colleagues as well. What struck me as well was when we hear about stories on the news about refugees and people that have been displaced from their homes, apart from me and my colleague Hella, who's in one of the stripy tops, all of those people there are displaced people. So they've all had to move from their homes at some point in recent weeks, months and years. And that really struck me actually, in that, you know, this isn't just kind of a Baptist church kind of rocking up and saying, yeah, sure, we'll help the people that have been affected across the country. These are people that are separated from their family. It's been covered a little bit in the news, but the martial law that's in place in Ukraine at the moment means that none of these men can actually legally leave the country unless they have a medical exemption, a certain number of young children. There's a few kind of small exceptions. So all of these people are separated in some form from their family, whether it's people still in areas of conflict or occupation or having fled to other countries. I want to tell you about Vera, who's on the right. She's got the red and blue and yellow stripes on her black jumper. Briefly, she was, I think she was just a volunteer. I couldn't quite work out her role actually whilst I was there. She was the sort of person that floats around and was very present at all times. But she was great. She was really lovely, and the most helpful thing was she had some English as well, because my level of Ukrainian now extends to about 3 words, and is not very useful. But we were talking with her a little bit as she was showing us around where they've got their offices, and we spent a little bit of time with all of them in various forms. And as we met for the last day before we drove back to Poland, we were having this time of prayer. We were kind of saying, thanks for having us. We're bringing prayers from across the world with us, and the work that they're doing is simply incredible given the circumstances. And Vera looked at me, pulled me aside at the end, and I think she really encapsulated or kind of summarized really well where the journey for lots of them have started. So in 2014, she was living in Crimea. And so she had left Crimea in 2014 when Crimea was occupied. And then there was possibly another move in that time, and she ended up in Kiev near Irpin. And then she's moved again in the last few weeks and months. So she's moved 2 or 3 times already. And I think I think that's the story for today. And I think this story around Easter time as well is so much of that one, and our faith really is one of journeys, both spiritual and practical as well. And Vera, for me, you know, kind of, you know, she said something along the lines of, oh, you know, I know, thank you so much for coming, because I know what it's like to come to somewhere where there is a war going on, or having been in a place where there is a war. And it just struck me that every single person in this photo is really on some sort of journey. And I think one of the touching things as well was, I think one of us was apologizing for crying about something, and pretty much any time someone did cry, they turned around and said, "We cry every day, it's fine." And so there's that real feeling amongst this team, and a few of the people there as well, is that they are there to serve. They're there to serve across the country to the churches that are responding. Churches just like this, you know, kind of small Baptist churches in different parts of Ukraine that have opened their doors, that have got people sleeping in different halls. They're giving out food. They're doing different things, and that's what they're there to do, and that they're there serving because of their faith as well, because of the kind of hope and the foundation that they've got in God. And as I said, this was in the top floor of Lviv Central Baptist Church. In the floor below, I think the 2 floors below, they turned some of the Sunday school rooms into dormitories. The floor below that, possibly the ground floor, was the kind of main sanctuary, behind which they had a kind of hall, which they were using to serve about 200 plus meals a day to refugees and volunteers that were there. And they had a kind of small kitchen, and various other cupboards with things like clothes and kind of small food banks and stuff. I think one of the things that struck me was that it was an ordinary Baptist church in that sense. It was very relatable. You know, you could go in and you knew roughly where the toilets were going to be. So the next story, or kind of part of the journey I want to take you on, is to Mariupol. So we kind of if you start back in 2014 with Vera in Crimea, she has left Crimea, and we head over to kind of more towards the east of the country and to the southeast, and there's Mariupol. And this is Bethany Baptist Church. I believe it's Bethany Baptist Church anyway. But as you can see, has been damaged by one of the strikes from Russia. And the Ukrainian Union reckon, for context actually, the Ukrainian Union is about the same size as the Baptist Union of Great Britain, similar sorts of sizes. So about, I think it's about 2,500 churches across kind of a number of different associations. So it's not a small kind of family of churches we're talking about within this country. And about, I think a week or 10 days ago, they were saying they had about 25 churches that had been either bombed out or damaged significantly from strikes in various ways. And Bethany Baptist Church was one of those. And we spoke to, whilst we were in Lviv, we spoke to a pastor called Gennady, and he had come from Mariupol. And he had left. He felt like he needed to leave. He felt like he had to escape when he was able to. And they had driven out. They had a car. They managed to get it working. They managed to get some fuel from it. They drove a little bit out. It broke down. They then decided to walk for a bit further. And one of the remarkable things he was saying to me was, he was saying that we were walking at one point, and there was a shelling about 10, 15 meters in front of us or something. And the only damage that he had, he said, was he had a very small piece of tarmac hit his leg. And it was just because of the angle of how the shelling hit that he was alive. And I think that was one of the other things that has come across in all the conversations, was that there are miracles happening left, right and center, practically, in terms of people being safe or feeling like they have been kept safe by God. And he carried on his journey. He ended up in Lviv, And he was telling us this story, and you could just see this kind of blankness in his face, really. And as he was talking, we were saying, "Oh, how are you feeling now?" And he said, "I just can't sleep. I am basically just getting reoccurring nightmares of shelling and bombing and artillery fire and things like that." And I think that was the other thing that struck me, is that, and I think this is clear in the news as well. This isn't a short, even if this war ended tomorrow, there is going to be so much trauma that people are dealing with that is going to be hard to deal with, that is kind of PTSD related and actual. And one of the things that, as a kind of family of churches around the world, that we can be looking at is that kind of the psychosocial support and the spiritual support for people. And we were talking to a couple of the pastors in Lviv, and they were saying, we've been helping people practically, we've been providing food, we've been providing water, shelter, things like that, but we know we need to start talking to people and helping them with the trauma that they've experienced. And we kind of had to pause them and kind of say, well, actually, I've done a small amount of psychological first aid training and various bits. We said, actually, you're already helping them, spiritually and psychologically. You're sitting down with people, you're welcoming them in, you're giving them a safe space, you're giving them their basic needs that they need, you're praying with them if they want to, and actually you're already meeting some of those real basic needs. And that was something else that struck me, is that actually I don't think we'll ever know the impact that the church has had in this crisis. We'll never know how many people have been touched or supported in different ways, because the church is a phenomenal network. You lose track of who talks to who in different places. So Gennady ended up in Lviv Baptist Church. This is not Lviv Baptist Church on the left. This is a Catholic, I think it's a Catholic church actually in Lviv, but I thought it illustrated that in Lviv, although it's in the west of Ukraine and it has had a few strikes recently, whilst I was there, we only had a couple of air raid alarms. And there is a sense of normality of people trying to just carry on with life. So we had some time on the Sunday afternoon after we'd been to church in Lviv Central Baptist Church, and there was jazz, street musicians, there were coffee shops open, there were people walking their dogs, there were people playing chess in the park. It was a sense of, the only way I can describe it was kind of not quite normal. The kind of normality of people trying to do their life, but if you turned the corner, you came across a church with some boarded up windows and sandbags on around, or the knowledge that there might be an air raid alarm at any moment. But that normality of life and rhythms of journeys, I think, we all try and do in different times. We've tried to do during COVID, we've tried to do over the last few years as people get back into the rhythms of daily life. They're life-saving in that sense. And for on the Sunday we were there, it was the first Sunday that the children were back to Sunday school in the Baptist church in Lviv as well, which I thought was a nice moment of kind of normality. And then carrying on, it's a very rapid journey, carrying on the journeys, we crossed back over into Poland, and where I'd been the week before as well, which some people are able to do, and there's been a lot of people that have been able to do, fortunately, where depending on which border crossing you cross at points, the border guards have been pointing the refugees to the Baptist churches, because they have had a reputation for just welcoming people, providing support, opening their arms, regardless of who they are and how much space the church might have at that time. And a little bit further on into Poland, just on the outskirts of Warsaw, is this church and this seminary. It's the Polish Baptist Seminary in Radosz. And it had simply a beautiful chapel, actually. And again, this, as every, I think it's about 95% of the Polish Baptist Union churches have opened their doors or are doing something in some way. And the kind of 5% that aren't are because they don't have their own building. There are about 110 Baptist churches in Poland that are with the Polish Baptist Union, so it's much smaller. But they are simply opening their doors and welcoming so many people to sleep, to stay. And this was the seminary that they had some spare rooms, so we stayed there whilst we were in Poland. And it felt like what could only be described as a church weekend away. It was such a nice environment. Although these were people that had suffered so much trauma, and we spoke to a few people that had suffered significant trauma, were clearly processing it still. There were children running around, there were birds kind of singing outside, there were people would sit down for a communal meal together, there were kind of evening kind of services, and it was a space of sanctuary, a space of family, and a space of that I felt really kind of encapsulated the body of Christ that the Bible reading was about. I think, and I think that's one of the things that the journeys that these different people have been on have kind of told me about or taught me, has been that everyone has their own journey in different ways, especially around Easter time. Everyone's going on so many different journeys, whether that's personal, spiritual, or anything like that. And they all interweave in different ways. You cross paths with different people at different times. And that's the beauty of being the body of Christ, is that we are all interconnected. And we kind of were asking both the Polish and the Ukrainians, what can people pray for? How can we support you best? And the answer was just pray for us, really. That every time we're kind of asking, is there anything else? Can we send food? Can we send clothes? Every single time it was just, no, we just know we need prayer. And the only answer to this is going to be prayer. And they certainly, the Ukrainians particularly, in a lot of the meetings we had, taught me a lot about grace, a lot about patience. I don't think I certainly didn't go embark on my kind of journey on this trip, expecting that I was going to be coming back thinking, oh my goodness, I really need to up my grace game, because the Ukrainians are incredible, absolutely incredible. And the situation's changing all the time. So I put some kind of generic prayer points up that were mentioned at various points throughout the trip. And there'll be ones that you have perhaps picked up as well from the news, or from kind of other conversations. But I think, given that it's the Easter Sunday in Ukraine as well, and that their request specifically has been to kind of pray for them and the people making decisions, both in the government and in their union, for the end of the war, and then for those surrounding countries that are receiving refugees. I think it would be good to pray, but also be joyful in prayer as well, that we know that Christ is risen. It is Easter Sunday. We may not know what this next kind of period looks like, but we have that kind of security and that knowledge of that, which I know is what they will be standing on today. So I have gone over time a little bit already, and there are more stories I had notes on in my notebook, so I'm sure I could tell you more. But I'll be around having coffee and tea afterwards as well. Well, it's up to you if you want time for there's time for questions and then prayer, perhaps.
We've probably got time for a couple of questions. If any of you have got something on your mind, that's somebody who's been there. We've got a roving microphone. So if you've got a question you want to ask Rachel, or you've got on something, just raise your hand and Richard will stamp around with the microphone. Oh, great.
Perhaps while people think of a question, I'll ask one. Rachel, what is your job? Why you? Why Ukraine? Tell them.
Thank you, Graham. This is my husband. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I did say I'd say a little bit more about it. So my job at BMS is the overseas team leader for relief. So basically I have responsibility for managing any of our crisis, like disaster relief responses. It's largely if there's a problem, I will be around. It's the kind of correlation. I have worked on things like BMS's COVID response, the Nepal earthquakes, cyclones in Mozambique, and my particular passion is working with, specifically with Baptist churches and Baptist unions to support the local church in their space and how they want to respond. So rather than lots of people kind of piling in and saying, you know, this is what we've got, this is what we can do, my passion is about going and saying, you know, kind of where are you at and how can we support you, and what might we be able to give from some of the experience that we've gained over the different years in countries around the world. And I've been working, BMS has seconded me to the European Baptist Federation, which is the kind of the European Baptist Union in that sense, which you're part of by being part of the Baptist Union of Great Britain, for a period of time to support them in this response as well. So I think that answers the question. Good.
You talked about moving between Poland and Ukraine. What is freedom of movement like? How easy is it to move around?
Yeah, it's a great question. The border crossings are always interesting wherever you go. It seems to me that they could definitely be a bit more efficient in checking documents. So apart from the usual bureaucracy of crossing borders, it took us about 2 hours to get into Ukraine and about 4.5 hours to get to kind of cross back. So apart from the martial law that is in place in terms of restricting some movements of males, the freedom of movement is actually really high. There's lots of crossing going on, and I think the latest figures as well, certainly that I saw, were saying that more people are actually returning to Ukraine than are leaving, certainly on the Polish-Ukraine border at the moment. And I think that's because there's a feeling that the conflict has moved back towards the east and south again, and people simply just want to be with their families and at home, regardless of the situation. So yeah, there's a lot of movement, and that applies as well for Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Moldova as well, which are some of the other countries that I'm working with at the moment. There's one over here.
It's just a practical question, really. I think Ukraine hasn't gone out of our prayers at all, but on the practical side of the joint work between the unions, what about those who wish to come over here and take up offered accommodation here and connecting them with Baptist churches here so that we can have some practical input?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great question. I think that's been one of the questions on quite a lot of people's mind, has been how can we support practically from the UK and within Baptist churches? And at the kind of union levels, I know the question has been, oh my goodness, there are 44 million people in Ukraine. How do we make sure that we're not completely overwhelmed in terms of making sure we can do what we do well? And so I know that the union has been having different conversations and making connections with charities that do this sort of work all the time. And are working with the kind of refugee and asylum process. So they've been the best places to talk to them in terms of what support they are able to give to Baptist churches in the UK, because they know the landscape more. Yeah. But it's a tricky one, because we had spoken to a few people in Poland that were waiting for visas, or for not just for the UK, but for America and other countries as well.
Janet's in the back.
Just wondered if there's any Baptist churches in Russia and what contact there is with them,
Yeah.
what their stance is.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So there is a Baptist Union of Russia. They are led by a guy called Peter. They are in a really tricky situation because if they speak out against the war, their freedom and security is at risk as well. And I think it was their seminary was actually closed down under kind of religious freedom laws and was only reopened about 18 months, 2 years ago. So they're in quite a precarious situation. So there has been various bits of contact with them in terms of at the regional and global level as well with the different organizations. The reality is sanctions mean not much can actually be done. But I know that they are valuing prayer. There is going to be a lot of relationship building that's going to need to be done after this, regardless of what stance people take. But one of the things we heard this week on a call as well is that there are a lot of Russian refugees that are now leaving Russia. Whether they're refugees, whether they're kind of economic migrants is another matter, but there's lots that are moving over into Georgia. And it's mainly young people that are very against the stance that the country has taken. And so that is something that I think the churches are concerned about as well, because you're suddenly losing a generation of people that are passionate about justice and passionate about church and faith as well. So they certainly do value the prayers, and it's a really tricky situation.